Much of Quaker worship evolved due to cultural and historical influences. Please describe an example in your context of influencing, of how the cultural context has influenced Quaker worship. Annie?
Yes, thank you, Gretchen. Well, there are, you've asked for one. I will mention that. I wanted to so get to it by just saying that there's an obvious direct connection with our program tradition because of Quakerism originating in Europe, originating in the UK. And so there is that direct connection with George Fox's original vision, and so the way the Quakers worshipped from that time. But an example then of a cultural shift that might have occurred is perhaps the thing I mentioned about Northern Ireland, because although they do have unprogrammed worship, they strongly identify themselves as evangelical and Christocentric. And that may well be because of the context of the very, very Christocentric and very intense Christianity that's been practiced in Northern Ireland due to the political history and the tensions that there have been on the island of Ireland. And so that may well have influenced the way friends there see their worship and think of themselves.
Wonderful. Yeah, very interesting, isn't it? How things evolve and it just changes with time. And I think when we're in those changes, it's often hard to see that, you know, how history and culture affects how we worship, but it happens all over the world. Bainito, can you respond to the question?
Yeah, since Africa is predominantly occupied by programs, both evangelical and not evangelical. The origin of the worship in Africa is from the section of the Americas. And since it came to Africa, mostly in 1902, and that's in East Africa, and in 1934 in Central Africa, the type of worship are predominantly oriented to our culture. Why do we say the African culture? Is because you may find most of our worship, they diverted from the origin where the US brought it, but it was incultured into the African culture, then that's why it spreads and it moves like that. Why do I say so? Because in most of our worship, when we want to dedicate a child, you may not find a young person being called to be able to dedicate a child, but an old friend will be able to call to dedicate a child. So this is more of a cultural respect. When the elder is there, is given preference than the young one. So that's one that is built to the culture. The singing also is also cultured into the African context. If I can give an example of Congo, who are worshiping, they have to worship lively when they have a live band, the guitars and all the drums there, and they'll be singing and dancing their Lingala and their local language, and they'll be worshiping. So this is one of the African. You look at Rwanda and Burundi, when they are singing, they jump and spiral jump like they have nothing in their flesh, and they go high up because they are worshiping in spirit and in their own cultural context. That's one thing that you look at it. You look at also in the Kenyan context, which is East Africa, we have also to sing, and mostly they are singing with the drums where possible. They are singing in drums, and when they are singing their local language and in their own drum beats, they really enjoy the worship and they sing like nobody's business. We have also isolated tribes in in East Africa, like Turkanas. When the Turkanas are singing and dancing and singing in their own vernacular, they are singing within their own cultural perspective of dancing and worshiping. So you may find that it's more of African culture, most of our culture, that is it, except the Southern Africa and West Africa, whereby is a direct implant of the worship from the West. Why the West? Because they will have friends who have been working and who have been born in these places from West, and they have come with their own culture, and they worship in the same culture, and that's why they maintain the same culture. So all the worship in Africa are culturally oriented, either from the origin or from the context where it's existing. So this is one thing that we are happy as Africa in this context. So we enjoy worshiping from our own perspective of our cultural orientation and be able to put it in our own spirit, in our own mind, and in our own flesh, so that we can be able to dance and sing and even preach and speak. When they are speaking from the African context, because they have to be charisma and they have to move, they have maybe to walk around. That's one thing that is more of our context. Thank you.
Thank you, Bainito. I want to ask you a question. Is it fair to say that because of the really Christian context in which, at least in Kenya, that the country is a very Christian context, is it fair to say that even as Quakers, even though you're singing and dancing, that you still are seen as kind of a quieter Christians?
Yes, comparatively, if you compare with other denominations that exist in Kenya, not only in Kenya, in East Africa, you may find that Quakers are termed to be more quiet than the rest of the worship groups or the other denominations. Yeah. However, when we get with the church has started making inroads in Tanzania, and in Tanzania, we give them a way of how to worship with the rest of the worship groups. So they are more of competing and more of at bar with the rest of denominations in Tanzania than in Kenya, because the missionaries came in Kenya and they came in a quiet place, and all along, it has now started becoming more vibrant to start even competing or emulating the other denominations. Like Nairobi Yearly Meeting, for example, you cannot be quiet in Nairobi and have members.
Yeah. Thank you, Bainito. That helps a lot, helps us understand.
Yeah.
Excellent, wow.
Thank
David,
you.
how would you describe the cultural context in the section of the Americas?
Well, there's a few different aspects to that. One of them is similar to what Bainito was saying, which has to do with missionary work to South and Central America in the early part of the 20th century, which again brought the Quaker version of pastoral meetings in a Christocentric manner to particularly Bolivia and Guatemala. It's since spread out from there. And there were and still are aspects of that indigenous culture that became a factor in how those worship services take place. For instance, in some cases, the indigenous language is used as well as Spanish in the services, but that would differ between the different countries depending on the indigenous language and whether they're more urban or rural and aspects like that. As far as dancing and jumping around, I've seen plenty of that, but the difference between them, I wouldn't have as intimate a knowledge of as Bainito does. So I can't speak to too many specifics, but there are differences there. And then going back further, the schisms that took place in the US about 100 years before that, early 19th century, were largely urban-rural splits, rich and poor. The theological differences seem to have been motivated quite a bit by different cultural circumstances. And even today, where you find in the East, particularly Philadelphia, which is kind of seen as the seat of Quakerism in the US, you'll have much more of the unprogrammed, usually liberal unprogrammed meetings. During the westward expansion in the middle 19th century, I've heard it said that a lot of the need for support of the people who were migrating was such that sort of unprogrammed worship really wasn't going to work for them nearly as well. So you get more pastored meetings. And as you go further west, this is a very general statement, but places like Iowa, Kansas, you're more likely to get pastored Friends meetings or Friends churches than you are particularly on the East Coast. So those are some of the issues that contribute to the different modes of worship here, I think. But over time, this has evolved. And so, you know, in North Carolina, you'll get all the kinds of versions of Quakerism and the same in other states. It would be hard to generalize that the West is more pastoral and the East more unprogrammed nowadays, but there's still traces of those cultural influences.
Yeah. I remember one time doing a presentation and trying to draw a map and using different, you know, and it was impossible in the US.
Yes. I'm glad you did that. It'll save me the work, Gretchen.
Yeah. Well, it's really hard. But Annie and I were talking earlier about when there was the Orthodox Hicksite split in Philadelphia yearly meeting, that at that point, Friends in what was then London yearly meeting, now Britain yearly meeting, Friends were much more Christocentric here in London than they are now. And so, you know, they would have supported the Orthodox Friends and were quite unhappy with Hicksites, whereas today, that cultural shift in Britain and in a lot of Europe has become more secularized. And so now Friends in Europe would be more resonant with the Hicksite. Yeah, so.
That's right.
I wonder if it's worth, speculating that because in the UK, for instance, and then Europe, as a result, stayed so cohesive and didn't have the schisms. I wonder if that's part of the reason why the cultural context now in very secular Europe can have such a powerful influence, so that we have, even within the program tradition, a lot of non-theists, people who identify as non-theists, you know, who are among Friends. And if there had been a schism, or if there had been more divisions, in a sense, they would have been a distraction and people could ally themselves with one group or another. But because it was one rather large and rather cohesive group, perhaps that's one reason why the outer culture and the secularization of the culture could have more of an impact, you know, within that one group, because there was no reason to go into a faction, so to speak, is what I mean. And it's impacted, it's very interesting how it's impacted our unprogrammed worship. You know, there's still many Christocentric Friends, but there are many who would identify as non-theist as well.
Yeah. Very interesting. And it allows for all of that, as Ireland Yearly Meeting, which has Northern Ireland Friends, evangelical. I mean, Ireland Yearly Meeting has really held that together in a remarkable way.
It's a challenge, huh?
It's a challenge. Devdas, can you describe for us what kind of cultural changes there have been in Quakerism?
The first thing, I can talk more about my country, India. Because I'm not very conversant with the Australia or New Zealand or other friends, but for India, I can speak in very clear way. So there is one very important point is there. The independence of India, before independence and after independence. Before independence, there were Quaker missionaries, and all the Quaker work was being done in Madhya Pradesh, Hoshangabad district. And at that time, the method of worship, it was very simple. Mostly the elders or the missionaries, they used to share their thoughts in the meeting. After independence, somehow these Quakers, they left India, and worship was arranged or managed by the local people. While managing those meetings, at that time also there was simplicity. there were people, they were sharing in a simple way. There was no very philosophical or very biblical sermons were not there. But whatever they used to speak or speech, that was very simple. But after some time, these Quakers, they felt themselves isolated. And the influence of the other Christian communities, as the evangelical Christians or other Christians, church organizations, people started thinking, why we do not have priests? Why we do not have nice worship buildings? Why we do not have the stage or platform? So in this way, step by step, the thinking of the people started changing. At the same time, previously there were marriages were being held between the Quaker community itself. But after some time, there were marriages from the outsiders also. The many members, the families, their wives or their husbands, they were not the Quakers. So it gradually changed the whole atmosphere of the worship in our India. So people, they were more, they thought that being a part of the Christianity, we should have a priest, we should have, pastor in our meeting house, we should have rituals in our meeting house. So this is a phase now, even in our meeting houses. So why not have a priest? Why we do not have rituals, baptism, Holy Communion in our churches? So because of some old Quaker people are there, still they try to explain them, this is what the Quakers are. So this is what our main objectives are there. But still, I tell you, after some time, there won't be any particular Quaker identity will be there. Because they will simply be Christians. All other Christian churches are there, Quaker churches are there.
Yeah.
So this difference, I find myself very difficult.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Devdas. I wonder if it's fair to say, because the Christians in India are a minority religion.
Yes.
That there's almost a need to be more cohesive with those that share your Christianity.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's a different reason for kind of becoming more interesting.
And the Quakers all over India, there are only now 1,500 to 2,000 Quakers are there.
In India.
So we do not have any identity except in particular areas. Because right from the beginning, the Quakers, they were working. So still, even now, there are few worship meeting houses where still there is simplicity, where still there is, but it is step by step will change.
Yeah, interesting. And you have in common with Africa, the missionary influence, and then having to create what is appropriate and meaningful to those, to you, to your country, to Quakers in your context. Yeah, fascinating, wonderful. Thank you. So let me